Good morning. The aim of this session is to have a look at the information that you need for the FDA Business BS 404 Employment Law coursework. And what I intend to do is go over some of the information that you need just to help you think about the content of your answer. Now, if you remember last Thursday morning on the 9th of November, I went through the actual question, and what you've got here is a quote from Justice McKenna, and the case here is ready-mix concrete. And the essence of this quote is for you to carefully and critically analyse whether you feel that the control test is a suitable test for establishing whether someone is classed as a self-employed person or an employee. Now, what I suggest, and I've already sent you electronic copies, and I'll make sure that you also have physical copies, and that will be for you to read the case of ready-mix concrete and Minister of Pensions, and it gives you a general idea about the discussions that were had in relation to working out the status of a worker. And generally speaking, there are two main types of workers. The first type of worker is an employed person or an employee, and the second type of worker is an independent contractor. The types of workers carry out different services. So an individual working under a contract of service is classed as an employed person. If you're working under a contract for services, then you're classed as self-employed. And the point of me going through this information is to look at the different tests available to work out the status of an individual working in an environment, an employment environment. And once we've established those different tests, we need to work out whether the statement by Justice McKenna is sufficient to identify the status of a worker. Now, I think we clearly established this point that the structure of your answer should be in three parts in general. So you would have your introduction, you would have the body of your answer, and then you would draw a suitable conclusion. Now, in the introduction, I always suggest it's a good idea to look at the employment contract as a whole. So the first thing you would do is carefully explain what an employment contract is. And we clearly stated in the lesson that an employment contract is a legally binding agreement between the offerer, generally the employer, and the offeree, generally the employee, and that agreement is legally binding, which is then enforceable by the courts. So, to put it simply, an employment contract is a legally binding agreement between two people which the courts will enforce. Once you've established that point, the next thing to think about is the elements that come together to form an employment contract. It goes without saying that there has to be an offer from one party, normally the employer. That offer has to be accepted. There has to be evidence of consideration, and apart from that, you must establish intention, and certain employment contracts will require capacity, and then a discussion of what we mean by form. So in your introduction, you don't need to write too much about the elements of an employment contract, but so long as you explain what an offer is, normally the first step towards forming an agreement, what the acceptance is, and that's generally accepting the terms available as offered to you by the employer. Consideration is simply an exchange of something valuable, so that means that you provide your service and your time, and in return for your service and time you get back your salary or income or wages. Capacity is to do with being capable of carrying out the contract. So certain contracts require you to be of a particular age, and also you need to be of sound mind. Intention simply demonstrates that if you go to work every day, then you intend to fulfill the contents of the contract. If your employer pays you every month or every week, depending on the frequency of your payments, then there's evidence that they have intention to keep you as an employee. Form simply means the nature in which the contract is created, and generally speaking, most employment contracts will be created in writing. So that's the form of the contract. Right, the next point we need to look at now is to actually define who a servant is. And I use the word servant interchangeably with the word worker. And a servant is defined by the Employment Rights Act 1996 and section 230 as somebody who works under a contract of service. So when you define the word servant, it's very important that you make sure that you attach a statutory authority, and that statutory authority is the Employment Rights Act 1996 and section 230. That gives you the definition of a servant. Now, once you've explained who a servant is, the most important stage next will be to explain the different tests available, bearing in mind that the question focuses on the control test, and then you've got to critically analyse whether the control test alone is sufficient to identify the status of a worker. So explain what the control test is, and that's simply looking at the amount of control that an employer has over an employee. So if, for example, the employer says to the employee, arrive at work at 9 o'clock every morning, if you need any time off, make sure that I agree to it and sign your annual leave sheet. If the employer tells the employee exactly how to carry out their duties and responsibility, then on the face of it, it looks as if the employee is under the control of the employer. And that's what the control test is all about. Once you've explained the control test, you then need to move on to case law or common law authority that describes circumstances where the courts have actually used the control test. So if you have a look at the cases of Motorola and Davidson, make sure that you explain what the case was all about. And if you remember, we spoke about three main parties being involved. You've got the agency finding a suitable worker for their client Motorola, and then if you remember, Mr. Davidson did something wrong in the workplace and was sacked by Motorola. Now the key legal issue here is that if Motorola had more control over Mr. Davidson than the agency, then technically speaking, Mr. Davidson couldn't be unfairly dismissed by Motorola. So it's a matter of just briefly describing each case that fits in with the control test and then applying it to the general question that you're answering. And the question here is the control test alone sufficient to establish the status of a worker? You've got other cases, Ewan and Noakes and Walker and Crystal Palace are all different cases, but they all emphasise what the control test is all about. Bear in mind that the control test was used many years ago when there was a clear distinction between an owner or an employer and a worker. And these days, I think it goes without saying that if you apply for a job, one of the qualities your employer would look for is the fact that you can work independently. So there might not be enough evidence of control over an employee, even though everything else in their contract suggests that they might be employed by the employer. So make sure you clearly explain what the control test is all about. And that's the point here. So link the control test to the statement of Justice McKenna and see if it's sufficient. Then move on to the organisation test and describe what the organisation test is about. The organisation test is simply that if a worker is part of an organisation, then generally speaking, they are classed as employed by the employer. It also means that any mistakes that they make become the responsibility of the employer. That suggests that the words vicarious liability apply to a worker who is part of an organisation. And to support your definition of the organisation test, Don't forget to refer to the case of Cassidy and Minister of Health. Talk about the fact that the claimant went into hospital with a poorly finger and came back worse. And the question was the doctor who treated him part of an organisation or not? Yes, he was, and therefore his mistakes will be the mistakes of the employer. And it emphasises the protection that you have as an employed person rather than somebody who works under a contract for services. Case law or other case law to do with the organisation test. You've got the case of Stevenson and Harrison and McDonald and Whitaker and Minister of Pensions, and these are all cases that you might independently research to make your work stand out, especially if you want to get higher grades. And I'll make sure, and I think I already have sent you a copy of the specific module assessment criteria that should help you include information that is relevant to get you the higher marks. Don't forget again, once you've looked at the organisation test, determine whether that's enough to identify the status of an individual worker. The last test is the multiple or the economic reality test, and this test is based on the case of Ready Mix Concrete and Minister of Pensions. So again, talk about the facts of the case of Ready Mix and identify 3 clear things that Justice McKenna stated. And those 3 things are simply that you are classed as an employed person if you provide your own work in exchange for consideration. The second point he raised to establish a worker as an employed person is the fact that if the employer exercises control over the worker, then generally speaking, that person is classed as an employed person. And the final point he raised in relation to clearly establishing the worker's status as employed is if there's nothing in the employment contract that suggests that they are self-employed rather than an employee. So 3 clear things to remember from what Justice McKenna said, and what he was doing in that case was to establish who an employed person was. And the first point is they provide their own work in exchange for consideration or a salary or an income. The second thing is they're willing to submit themselves to their manager or employer in order to accept control from the employer. And the third and final point is that there is nothing in their contract that suggests that they are self-employed rather than an employed person. And if you can elaborate on these 3 points, it demonstrates very good understanding of the legal principle in the case of Ready Mix Concrete and Minister of Pensions. And then after that case, you draw your own conclusions. Okay, so the final bit of my short presentation in relation to the help you need for the coursework is to make sure that you have a look at the statement by Justice McKenna, and that's the assessment question, and answer yes or no as to whether just the control test on its own in this current climate, in a modern working environment, is sufficient to say a worker is either self-employed or not. It goes without saying that when you think about the development of other tests, then the obvious answer seems to be that the control test alone is not sufficient to establish the status of a worker. So once you've considered all these points, it's just a matter of making sure that you've included suitable legal authority, stayed within the word count, which is 10% above or below, and hopefully you should be able to produce a suitable answer which will attract a very good grade. Thank you for listening to this short video, and don't forget, if you have any other questions, please email me or arrange to speak to me directly. Thank you.